I'm Riley,
And I'm Ronnie,
and this is the Plan to Eat podcast.
where we have conversations about meal planning, food, and wellness to help you answer the question, what's for dinner? Hello, and welcome to the Plan to Eat podcast. Today, we have an interview with Kristin Saxena. She is a pediatrician, a mom. She is the host of a podcast called Feeding the Family, and she has a new book coming out called The Happier Meal, How to Enjoy Your Food and Your Kid.
So that's what we talked about. We talked about her book, why she wrote it, how she got to the place of wanting to put a book out there in the world. We talked a lot about getting the family together around the dinner table and having a family meal and the benefits of that. The benefits of eating together as a family are tremendous. I got a ton out of this podcast, and I'm really excited for you guys to hear this and learn and hopefully implement some of these things into your life too.
Kristin, thanks for joining us on the podcast today. We appreciate you being here.
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so let's just talk a little bit about, why don't you give everybody your intro of who you are and what you do?
Okay. Yeah. I always feel like that's one of the hardest questions I get anymore is I feel like I have kind of like a weird life, but I'll keep it as brief as I can. So I am a mom of four from Nebraska. As we talked about earlier, married to my high school sweetheart. I am a pediatrician by training and have always been interested in nutrition and sort of feeding practices and worked, as you can imagine, as a pediatrician. That came up a lot in my day-to-day work. But in more recent years, I kind of really wanted to get more into the nitty-gritty of feeding kids and feeding people, but wondered if there was something that I could do that could kind of reach more people than you kind of see in an everyday clinic. And so what I've wanted to do for years and years, so it's fun to see this kind of finally coming to fruition, is to write a book that was sort of everything that I had learned up to this point, with sort of my tips and tricks and advice and experience in feeding kids, and finally getting that out. So I've got that, the Happier Meal coming out. And then as part of that, I also started a podcast, mostly because I was already speaking to people sort of in this space. And I felt like there was so much good information I was getting. I wanted to be able to share all that information as well. So I host a podcast called Feeding the Family with Dr. Kristin, and we talk a lot about that same subject.
We're really excited about your book. Ronnie and I have both had a chance to review some of it. And personally, I love it. I have a 2-year-old. And so a lot of it resonated with me, just like a personal level, of course. And I love the subtitle of your book, which is How to Enjoy Your Food and Your Kid. Because I think that it can be such a pain point for people, that meals just become miserable.
Yeah.
So enjoying food and your kid. It's a very clever and real, relatable subtitle.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's kind of funny even coming to that. Like I said, I've been wanting to write this book. I want to say for over 10 years, but the book I have today that I've written is not the same book I would have written 10 years ago. So I'm really glad. And I think some of that came from just my experience as a parent myself, as you start to realize like the key is really just that, like making it enjoyable. And that's where you start to see the success coming from the practice of family meals and eating together and feeding your kids. Like it has to be enjoyable for everybody in order for it to really work.
Yeah. And just before anybody starts getting squirrely at their house because they think they have to start implementing crazy things into their life, your book gives so many tangible tips, and it just makes it feel all just not overwhelming. I think that was one of the biggest things I got out of the book as I was reading it, is just you keep it very realistic. You're not saying, okay, you're doing this, now do a complete change and do everything different. It's really tools to start to like change your thinking around it. And then just really simple tips for implementing food changes and mealtime changes, and just like even thinking about your children's age and where they're at. So it's really just I don't know the right word, but it's just a helpful guidebook. And so that was one thing that I just wanted to tell you that I'm really excited about, and that listeners know if they want to get your book, that it's not, you have to change everything about your life. It's really doable. and really simple. You don't walk away feeling overwhelmed. You feel empowered. So that's a great thing.
Well, thank you so much. That actually really means a lot to me. My best friend actually, she's read my book as well, and probably the best compliment I got from her was, you don't make people feel bad about themselves. And she's like, that's what I found was the most valuable about it, and that made me really happy. And I think that's because, again, like if you read the book, you realize, I a little bit of a type A person by nature. And I think, as a pediatrician, and I thought I knew, exactly what we should be eating. I knew the science, all of these things. And then I had real kids. And I was like, oh man, like this does not work. And so I think that that's just it, is I went through the whole process of feeling bad, feeling like I'm failing. And I think it was only through through that process that I was really able to really look at exactly like you said, this isn't about making us feel bad for what we do. It's about meeting ourselves where we are, having some goals, achievable goals, figuring out like what's actually the most important thing I can do that's of benefit to my children and my family, and focus on those things. And then, you can build from there. But the guilt and I think the shame and the stress that we feel a lot as parents around feeding our kids doesn't really do us any good in the long run.
I love that you have this little phrase that you say where you say family first and food second. And that, I think a lot of times when people are thinking about, sitting around at the dinner table or having a family meal, it's so focused on the food and having this like June cleaver kind of a dinner. And in your book, you talk about how it doesn't have to be that way at all, as long the real important part is getting people to have a dinner together and the connection and the benefits that that bring. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of those benefits about that like family dinners have?
Absolutely. That's like my favorite topic in the world. So you don't want to bring this up to me at like a dinner party because then I'll never stop talking. But yeah, so I think that was probably what I learned. Like I said, I came from, this medical background, all about the science. I was super interested in like what's the very best diet, serving size for people and children of each age. And what I came to realize through life, through helping families, and then just through my own research, is that the biggest benefits really come from what we call like family meals. So just this practice of eating together. And the way that I like to define a family meal is just, you know, you sitting with your family, however you define it, your child, your family can be your auntie, your friends, people define who is their family. You sitting with them, facing each other, sharing the same food without distraction, like phone and TVs. It has nothing to do with, like you said, the fancy place setting. It doesn't even have to do with necessarily the food that you're eating. I like to include that sharing the same food because, as we get into, especially with feeding kids, people fall a lot into the practice of short order cooking. And so I like to get people into this one family, one meal. And certainly their strategy is to meet yourself where you are with that as well. But because I think that's, if you look at the research, there's a ton of benefits that come just from this practice of having these family meals together. And the benefits really run the gamut. So everything from kids doing better in school, kids engaging in what we call like less risky behaviors, things like drugs, alcohol, getting in trouble at school, early sexual activity, tobacco use. And then we also, and those are things that have nothing to do really with what you're eating. But you do also see that we'll see, less disordered eating, less obesity, actually better nutrition profiles. So kids and adults that eat more family meals tend to have, like healthier weights, as well as to eat more fruits and vegetables, less fried food. So you tend to eat better, whether you're a child or adult, if you engage in family meals. Also, kids and adults, we tend to see less depression in people who eat more family meals. Kids who eat more family meals tend to be less anxious, more resilient. I mean, it just keeps going on and on and on. And, to me, that was a big eye opener because I think that the family meal is, I think, something that most people think is good. Like if you ask, it's like, oh, is it good to have family meals? People will say, sure, of course. But I don't think we realize how big it is, because when I think about like the other things that make having family meals hard, and I think that that's a lot, the overscheduling that we see in life and families. And I mean, I have 4 kids, and my husband and I are busy people. So I'm the first one to like, I mean, it's juggling schedules. And if I wasn't crazy about family meals, I think my kids would say a little bit, I'm crazy about it wouldn't happen as often as it does.
Yeah.
But when I think about it, it's like, your fourth grade basketball practice doesn't carry the same amount of benefits as I know that family meals do, right? So I think when you start to put it in perspective, it helps you say, like, this really is something. I can't think of honestly anything else that we do that has that far reaching of benefit. And before we get off this topic, I do love to share my very favorite study about family meals is that they studied preschoolers and how often that they ate with their families. And they correlated this with their reading readiness when they got to kindergarten. And they found that the kids who had more family meals, that having more family meals actually correlated better with reading readiness in kindergarten than even being read to by your parents. And of course, like I want everyone to read to their children, of course, but I think it's the value of the words they hear and the conversations and the storytelling that happens around the table has so much value, even to a child's vocabulary and things of that nature that you don't even realize. And so to think that that would make you even more ready for kindergarten than even, we all try to diligently read to our child, but um, if you had to pick one, really, it would be better to just sit down and include them at dinner.
That's an amazing study. What do you think it is about this experience that adds so much value to our lives?
Again, I think a lot of it is just the conversation,
Mhm.
and some of it is just the storytelling. So I think this idea of, kids learning resilience and learning from other people's, successes and failures,
Mhm.
telling the story. That's the other thing too, is I encourage people to have those meals, but then also, try to have those conversations. It's a great time to talk about a time that, something went wrong. Sometime you failed. I think some of those can be some of the best stories you tell your kids, because they pick up on those things like, okay, you failed. You did something wrong. You fixed it. You're still okay. And you're here today. Right. I mean, I think it's those little lessons that they learn. That's part of it. I think that especially with older kids, it provides a time for like a regular check-in.
Mhm.
I think especially with adolescents and teenagers as they start to get more busy. And I always say, little people, little problems, big people, big problems. So, it starts to give you that time where just that little check-in. And I think that that's another big reason that we see like some of those problems not getting as out of hand, because when you're checking in regularly with them, you start to see a red flag, something's off about you. I'm going to look into this. I think it just allows those problems not to get so out of hand. So
Mhm.
that's just a few examples. I mean,
Mhm.
you can also just see, like a child seeing what a regular meal looks like, developing manners at the table. I mean, there's so much that can come from just that experience, but I think it's just that focused togetherness that has such far-reaching benefits.
Right. One thing you mentioned, I think you actually mentioned it pretty briefly in your book, but you said that there was a certain point in time a couple years ago where your grandmother and your kid's great great grandmother was eating family dinners with you. And I loved that. I love that for this idea of storytelling and for everybody in the family to get to like hear stories of the life that she lived, but then also, potentially like the mental health benefits for somebody who's older, like spending time around young people and like experiencing like liveliness and a good conversation. Like that to me sounds so invaluable.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a crazy experience. So my grandmother, she passed away now just about a year ago, and she was just shy of her 100th birthday. And
Oh
for
my
about
gosh.
I know. And so for about 6 months before that, she had moved in with us. And prior to that, she had been living in a nursing home, and she just was quickly kind of going downhill It was during COVID. She had to be very isolated. It was just not very good for her. And that's why we made the decision to move her in with us. And honestly, when she first got to my house, she was in very rough shape. And I was honestly quite overwhelmed, thinking,
Mhm.
what did I get myself into? We have 4 kids and then grandma who needs a lot of help. But I can't even tell you, I like to say, and I know again, like I'm very pro family meals, but she improved so substantially, just her mental health, even her physical health status in those 6 months that she was here. She was so much more functional, talkative, able to do more and more things independently. And I like to say that that was a lot just because we had family meals together. Because again, we didn't do anything special. She actually came here on hospice. She wasn't getting any, magical medical treatments, nothing like that. She just sat around the table, was part of a family, and sort of enjoyed the social engagement that goes with all of that. And I have to say, too, for my kids, I also like to say when I first did that, she first moved in and I was very stressed out, and people kept saying, "Oh, you're making such wonderful memories for your kids." And I was like, please, one more person tells me this. I can't handle it. But true, but truly, like the stories that she would tell, I mean, it blew my mind. But my kids, she literally took a horse and buggy to school. They
Wow.
didn't have refrigerators when she was small. And so she would tell these stories, and my kids, it was like they were talking to like a pioneer. They were like, "What are you talking about? Like, where did you keep your food?" And she's like, "Oh, down in the cellar." And she would talk all about this. And it was just such an incredible experience, honestly, for them. And I think that, those are conversations that when's my 7-year-old going to have opportunities to talk with someone who's 100 years old about their life as a child. But honestly, I truly believe that the experience bought my grandma 6 healthy months
Mm.
of life.
I imagine that that value add to her life was far greater than you can even like, you saw it, but I think it was probably far greater because she was getting to tell as much as it benefited your children to hear her stories, I feel like it probably benefited her to tell them to someone.
Mm,
Mhm.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that that's exactly right. And I think that that's the other thing is just that social element. I don't think we realize how important that is just for all of our mental health is just that experience. You're right. To be able to sort out your own stories and tell them, and as well as to just like hear about other people's lives.
Well, I think it's just to me, it's just a powerful story that, family meals go both ways. It's not just beneficial for kids, but it's beneficial for people of all ages. And I think that
Mhm.
that's like a really important thing for people to for, everybody to remember is that like it's beneficial for everybody, no matter if you're 7 years old or if you're 97 years old. So
It's
that's
true.
really cool.
Yeah. You shared a story, I think that your spouse, you guys went on this picnic and it was like a pizza and pop kind of picnic, and you talked about how he was sharing like a negative or like a failure, something that he did in his day that he wouldn't have deemed like correct. I'm not sure how you described it, but I think that, hearing that mom and dad aren't perfect and that they have to navigate hard things too, like builds some camaraderie because I mean, you said little people, little problems, big people, big problems. And as you grow up, you realize like you can talk to that person and say, here's my problem. I can tell my mom
Mhm.
or dad because they aren't perfect.
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of value in that. And then children tend to have such a gentle or I don't know, joyful, I don't know what the word is, perspective on things. And they can offer more encouragement than you would even realize that you would get from a little person. But they have just
Sure.
such a happy perspective about life. Like, oh, dad, it'll be fine, because you can do it. It's like, oh, yeah, I can do it.
Oh, that is so true. That I think is an excellent point, and maybe that's something that like I should highlight more. Is I think it's very true. I think you underestimate too how encouraging kids are and how they can totally put some of your own problems
Mhm.
into perspective. I remember this is a funny story. It just made me think of back from high school. But I remember that there was a girl in my high school. And she came from a pretty large family, so she was one of the older kids. and she had a younger brother, like 7 years old or something. And she was running for like student council president. And she's like, yeah, I remember I was sitting at dinner and I told my brother, I'm so nervous. I'm running for president and I don't know if I'm going to get elected. I really want to, but I'm very nervous. And she said, and my brother last night said, you're running for president of the United States.
Oh,
And she said, no, just of my school. And he goes, oh, Jenny, you can do that. Like, he was like, that's no big deal. So she was like, and she made that part of her speech and I'll never forget it. But I think it's, again, like just this value that children have to put in perspective. Like, oh, come on. It's just of your school. No big deal. But it could be really helpful because I think that's totally true. I can be stressed about stuff and your kids will just kind of remind you of what's important.
well, and I think that this goes back to the story. This whole thing goes back to the story with your husband, but just like the way your children view you, I guess that this is how family dinners go both ways. It's not about the little people, and parents are just trying to invest in the little people. It's the little people investing in the parents or the grandparents or whoever your family is, whoever is around your table. And you start to see yourself through someone else's eyes. And I think that that's probably a benefit that is maybe underestimated. Like, but that little brother is saying like, you're running for president of the United States. Like he probably thought she could do that too. Because his opinion of her is so great. My daughter tends to think I can fix everything, everything, things that cannot be broken or cannot be fixed, that I can fix them. And it's fun in some ways to just feel like a superhero to someone. And I think that how does that not build confidence in every person around that table when that's the kind of conversation and kind of just perspective you're getting by looking somebody else in the eyes and just feeling the way they feel about you from them.
Totally. That reminds me too. I have a good friend, and this one always makes me a little bit emotional, but I think as a parent with younger kids, she says, I always remind myself I'll never be as loved as I am right now. And she's like, and that gets me through a lot of hard parenting. She's like, I have my parents love me. I have a spouse and I have these kids and they're never going to love me as much as they do right now. And so I think it's like, it's a good reminder. It's because it can be really hard. And then you go, but you know what? This is probably the biggest love time I'll ever have in my life, but I need to try to soak it in.
Okay, so I hope that everybody's convinced that they want to have more family dinners, right? So
Me too.
yeah. So can you give us some of your tips for implementing this if you're a family who's like low on the family dinner scale,
Mhm. Absolutely. So I always say, one is better than none and more is always better. So it's all about just meeting yourself where you are right now. So if you are a family that does not do any family meals, first of all, I think that's just not us. And I like say it can be anyone. So family meals are all about just being who you are. This is us right now. And all of it's okay. So again, like I said, if it seems like this is don't try to say like this is what we do now to a family that hasn't been doing. They're gonna rebel and you're gonna have a hard time. So maybe just start with one, even if it's a special occasion. Say, okay, fine, we're gonna have family dinner for so and so's birthday. That's a great starting point. Some sort of special occasion. If that's great, then maybe you start with once a week. Say, all right, we have crazy busy schedules. This is really hard, but Sunday evening, most of the time we're home. Perfect. Like I said, one is better than none. And then you just build from there. I think the key again is to make sure that you're focusing on the family versus the food. So I also say if you're just starting that, just eat what you eat now, just eat it together. If you get takeout every night, that's fine. Just sit down and eat the takeout together, no phone, sit and just start there. Then, if down the line your goals are to say, I'd like to eat for takeout, well, then fine. Then you say, oh, no, on Mondays, whatever, I make sandwiches. Just keep it simple. Make it achievable. And then I think that's the other thing is it's like those little wins. Once you have those little wins, you're like, oh, I can do this. And then, with our takeout, I can also make a salad or whatever. So it's all just about meeting yourself where you're at and making one tiny little incremental improvement from there.
That's great. Do you think that there's a difference in your experience? Is there a difference between different age groups of like implementing this, or is this like the foundational stepping stone to start with? Is to just start where you're at and start small?
You mean in terms of how old like your kids are,
Yeah,
or?
like toddlers versus teenagers. Like, is there a difference in getting everybody together?
Well, I mean, obviously, you have a little bit more control over toddlers, I feel like, than teenagers. However, I 100% believe that the benefits span the whole lifespan. And
Hmm.
so, like, to say, my kid is 16, 17 years old, it's too late. No. And these are so important for teenagers. And even though they may fight you on it, I think that kids like that structure. They like that togetherness. They like that sense of attachment, even if it doesn't always seem like it. So, of course, I say the earlier the better, but I also totally believe, like with my grandma at 99, it is never too late to see those benefits. And so I think that it doesn't matter the age. Again, it's just sort of starting with, and older kids tend to be busier. So I think that as kids get more and more activities, it does get a little bit more challenging. But, um, I think that the benefits are it's worth it literally at any age.
Yeah.
I expect that for anybody who starts to implement these things, as soon as they start to see benefits are always motivating or like actual results are motivating to people. So as they start seeing these positive changes happen from these little steps they're taking, I think it'll become easier. A couple of things that you said in your book, you talked about, like, not stressing about the food, and you just talked about that with takeout, but I loved that, like, you even one of your example was that you guys got pizza and pop and went to the park, and you're like, "It is what it is, like, this is what we did," and you probably yeah, everybody loved it, and maybe for your teenagers, it was a more motivating get-together because it was things that they really
Absolutely.
wanted or whatever. But another thing you said is that it doesn't have to just be dinner. It could be, like, a breakfast here or a lunch there. And again, these are just such tangible and easy things to try to implement. And then once those benefits start to happen in people's families, I think that it just, even for teenagers, they're gonna be like, oh, that was kind of fun. And they don't know why
Totally.
they liked it, but they'll come back.
Well, and I think that that's the key too, is that in order to really see a lot of those benefits and to make it something that you'll sustain, it has to be enjoyable, at least
Mhm.
pleasant. And I
Yeah.
think that's where I see too is to make it about the family and not the food. Cause I think, especially as a parent, there's a part of you, and I always say it's like your caveman brain that's like really worried about what your kid is eating. Like, are they eating enough? Are they eating too much? Are they eating the right thing? And I know that comes from a good place, but I think it makes us as parents engage in behaviors that tend to make the mealtime unpleasant for us and for the kids. And that's where I see this, enjoying your food and your kids is that you have to just stop stressing out about how much your kid is eating of what. We see this like crying at the dinner table till you eat two more bites of broccoli, and that's not where you're going to see people wanting to come to dinner.
Mhm.
We all want to feel important and valued. And to me, it seems like particularly as a teenager, I can just think back to being a teenager and like rolling my eyes at so many things that like my mom wanted to do or my family wanted to do. And so to me, it seems like even if that's the attitude of your teenager, there's an element that if you're focusing your meal times on like everybody at this table feels valued and everybody feels important, even if they roll their eyes every time at the dinner table, like you're giving them something internally that they'll be able to, take for the rest of their life and help them feel good about themselves and stuff. So I personally think that's really important if you're feeling like, I don't know, my 16-year-old's just going to roll their eyes every time they come to the table.
And that may be true. And I think that that's just exactly it. So it just becomes about hanging out,
Yeah.
really. You know what I mean? So what can you do? What do they like to talk about? I think as a parent, that's what it is. It might not be the most engaging conversation you ever had. And sometimes with teenagers, you're exactly right. We all were teenagers, and you look back and you're like, I was probably kind of difficult to talk to sometimes. But, like that's where I think it's just figuring out, well, what are the things that they're interested in? What
Hmm.
happened? And that's the other thing too. And I don't know, especially sometimes with boys, it can be difficult. How was your day? Fine, good. How are your friends? Good. So, it's about just figuring out, well, what's a topic that maybe they'll really get going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's fun.
I feel like the same is true for someone who's 99.
Yeah.
What is a 17-year-old and a 99-year-old going to talk about where they find common ground? It's like, but I mean, there are things. I know there are things. I'm coming up with them in my
Mhm.
mind right now, but the 17-year-old might not know the answer to that. Um,
Yeah.
and so for both parties, like kind of everyone coming to the table with that mentality, I think is really important. And I think that's something that grows as people get older and change because, 2-year-old is not going to have the cognitive space to be like, I need to talk to my mom about what she wants to talk about so I can connect with her. But, for
Absolutely.
everybody who's coming to the table, I think it's important to kind of have that mindset of like, where's our common ground here?
Mhm.
And for your grandmother to tell stories about her childhood, I think that is so special and so unique for your kids. I'm going back to that a little bit, but that's that kind of like that's common ground. They didn't know that, and she would love to tell it. And so that was kind of how they got to that point of like having these awesome conversations, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Well, and they laughed at, or we all really laughed. She went from, like I said, riding, a horse to school to, she had a Facebook page, and that's all in one lifetime. Like, it's just, I think that for all, even for me, like, I'm like, I guess I knew that, but you're blowing my mind right now. Like, what's going on?
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we have certainly uh, talked about them sitting together as a family and eating family dinners together. But I would love to give you an opportunity to kind of give people an overview of the rest of the book and what they might like, maybe where like someone's pain points might be and where they could find help in your book. I think that might be really
Mhm.
valuable for people listening.
Yeah. So, of course, I focus a lot on the family meals, but then also a lot of it is just about the strategies that come with making them actually happen. And then again, making them pleasant experiences. And so I know, one of the big things we talk about is knowing what's developmentally normal for your child, because I think that, again, I myself experienced it. And certainly as a pediatrician, people always had questions and concerns. And I like to remind people that, that's coming from a good, very caring place, but you have to think about how you're reacting. And also it's important to know like some of these things that even though they're a little bit challenging to experience as a parent are very developmentally normal for your child. So a good example of that is where we see kids kind of getting into the toddler years, and parents will often be like, oh, he used to eat everything. He used to, I'd puree all these fresh vegetables, or he'd eat everything. And now he's very, very picky and he doesn't want to eat anything. It's actually quite developmentally normal for a child to go through what we would call a picky phase. But what I like to remind people is you have to think about, again, you have to think about like humans way back when. And so you had a baby that couldn't get around on its own. It's safe for it to eat every single thing you give it, right? But then you start to get little cave baby running around and he can get away on its own. It isn't safe for him to eat every single thing that he finds. So it's very normal that the brain would be wired in such a way to say, right now, I'm going to be very suspicious of things that look and smell and taste funny to me, right? That's new. I'm not sure if it's safe to eat. It's frustrating because you're like, what are you talking about? This is, I'm telling you it's safe, eat it. But when you think about, okay, this is actually just a human brain doing things that are healthy and safe for it, it helps, I think. And then it's much easier to think, okay, this is normal. What I need to do is focus on what we call exposures, saying, I see it several times. I see people eating it and not dying. The brain learns those things over time, and it becomes much more likely that they'll try them and eat them and enjoy them. Now everybody's a little bit different. So some kids that might be 2 exposures, some kids that might be 200. And again, just also you start to see, your toddler and your baby just ate and ate and ate and ate. Then you get into these sort of school years. And I've had people say, I feel like my kid exists on air. He doesn't eat anything. And so a lot of it just has to do with, that growth trajectory really starts to slow down. You think about the growth in the first couple of years, it's super fast. And then we see this really slowing down until you start to get to those adolescent years. And there again, you can see, I mean, maybe you guys remember too, but teenagers and adolescents, they can put away a lot of food sometimes. And again, that might be something depending on parents' concerns, that can be very alarming. And so it's knowing what's normal, making sure that you're checking in with your child's doctor too, to make sure, are they growing and developing normally? Is there an actual medical problem I need to worry about? Um, and then thinking a lot about like, but what is my response doing in the long run? And a lot of times the best response is like very little, if any, intervention at all. But that's hard to know. And it's really like, you want to get your kid to eat the way you want them to eat, but the strategies that we use are often very short sighted. And so it's easy to think, well, what does this translate to in the long run? An example might be you say, I feel like my kid doesn't eat enough. So if I get them, if I set up the iPad and they watch the movie, I can usually shovel a few more bites into their mouth because they're distracted. And then you at the same time might be saying like, oh my gosh, I sat here and I ate this whole pint of ice cream, not even realizing it while I watched this Netflix special. Well, we kind of are setting ourselves up. You can kind of see how those were the same thing. And so
Mhm.
it's like, well, I don't really want that for my child. So I need to think about the long term, what am I teaching them to do? And if it's to ignore their own internal cues, it's probably not the best strategy for them in the long run.
I liked one of the quotes that you provided from Ellen Satter, which is parents provide, kids decide. I think
Mhm.
we talked about that a little bit on the podcast last year with a woman named Katie Kimball, but just basically giving your kids all of the options, and like they're going to decide the things that they think, taste the best or feel the best, or whatever it is for their current situation. And you're still giving them the exposure by having it on their plate, even if they don't eat it the first 10 times.
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah, I love Ellen Satter. So she's like a child feeding guru. She's a genius. And yeah, so this idea of what she calls the division of responsibility. And so that has to do with sort of parents have jobs in feeding and kids have jobs in feeding. And you kind of have to stay in your own lane. And so the parent's job is I get to decide, what's for the meal, when we're going to eat, and where we're going to eat. And the kid gets to decide how much they're going to eat of what is offered, and or if they're going to eat any of it. And so that's, again, though, it sounds simple, and then in real life it actually gets complicated because it kind of contradicts sometimes what you feel like saying or doing. But really, if you can stay in your lanes, you eliminate those mealtime battles, because the battles are generally, the kid, either the kid wins and you make them whatever they want to eat whenever they want to eat it, or the parent wins and they, force the kid to eat more or something they don't want to eat. But again, we've talked about in the long run, you didn't really probably accomplish what you would hope to accomplish.
I feel like I've heard this with that analogy with sleep. Like I can provide
Mm.
a place for them to sleep, but I cannot force them to go to sleep. And I think that that's a little bit easier to like come to terms with as a parent, because sleep, like literally can't force your child to go to sleep. Like no one can force me to go to sleep. And so I think using that same thought process with eating is really helpful, because I do think that the sleep thing is a little bit more well known or widely spread. Like I can
Mm.
provide for them all of these things, but I can't make them actually fall asleep. And so kind of applying that same mentality to food, I think is really helpful.
I like that. I like that because I was never, well, I always said too, I wasn't like the pediatrician for everyone, because I was never like a sleep trainer type person, because I kind of felt the same way, like they're going to sleep when they're going to sleep. And, I can set a bedtime and a rule that you need to be in your bed at X time. But like you said, I can't control. That doesn't mean you're getting 89 hours of sleep just because you're there.
One other thing that I wanted to bring up I don't want to take up too much of your time, so before we close up, but you talked a lot about your story in the book, and I think that it's made me think, since reading that, it's made me think a lot about my journey with food, and not trying to force like things that I believe or things that I think or struggles that I have onto my daughter's eating. My
Mhm.
example is that since I read your book, my daughter said she wanted a cookie, and it was like a treat for her that day that she got for doing something, and we don't always reward with treats, but this day it was that, and so I was like, "Okay," and so she goes to the cabinet, and she pulled out a bag of dates, and I was thinking like, that's not a cookie. And I almost was like, you're not going to like that. I almost said that to her. And instead I stopped and I said, sure, if that's what you want as your cookie, you can have that. And she pulled one out and she ate half of it. And then she never asked for another cookie. I mean, she didn't even eat the whole thing. I mean, dates are incredibly sweet, but she didn't eat, she didn't even eat all of it, but she never asked me for her real cookie,
Uh-huh.
ever. But it gave me pause to think, you're probably not gonna like that, and, like, put that on her, and then she believes
Mhm.
that, "Oh, well, I don't really like those." I gave her the opportunity to decide for herself if she likes it or not, and that's totally a win because I read your book, because that was in my brain of, like, I'm not gonna put that on her. I'm not gonna tell her that this food is not good or that she won't like it, because she can kind of decide that for herself, and that the same could be applied to, like, beets or broccoli or whatever people are
Mhm.
eating that a toddler may or may not enjoy, and kind of holding myself back from, like, holding her back, I guess. So I
Yeah,
really I benefited a lot from that.
I'm so glad. That makes me so happy. No, I think that that's true too. And it's one of the more exhausting things, I think, because, the truth is that a lot of the things we do and a lot of the, you know, again, come in love, but like sort of misdirected things that we do as parents, a lot of it stems from our own anxieties, our
Mhm.
own experiences, and maybe our own issues with food, eating, body image, and all of those things. And so I find that always exhausting as a parent because you're like, oh, I just want to do good for my kid. I don't want to fix myself. But the truth is that in the long run, honestly, I think that the experience is the more I learn and the more you realize, like, I need to be good to myself in order to be good to my kids. It makes you more conscious of your own inherent biases and sort of your own anxieties. And I really feel like, through this experience, I myself developed better relationship with food and my body and eating, all of those things, not only because you learn it and you realize you want that for your kids, and you think, well, I kind of want that for myself. And as a bonus, the better I get at it myself, the better I'll do for them. So I think that's kind of where it does come full circle, where everyone sort of benefits from these practices. Even though I'm the first one to say at the beginning, it's like, oh my gosh, can I just do good for my kid and then like whatever, like, can I just like eat a cheeseburger in the back? I don't want to do this.
Okay, well, Kristin, why don't you tell everybody where they can connect with you online, remind us the title of your book, and we will close out our podcast.
You bet. So you can connect with me online at KristinSaxena.com. Also, to check out our podcast, which is Feeding the Family with Dr. Kristin. That's available pretty much anywhere that you would get your podcast. And then the book is titled The Happier Meal, How to Enjoy Your Food and Your Kid. And you can get that when it's out this spring on Amazon, probably the easiest place to look
Excellent.
for that.
Awesome.
Well, we like to end our podcast talking about a recipe. So if you have
Oh,
a recipe or a meal that you've eaten recently, whether you made it or you got takeout or whatever that you really loved and enjoyed, we would love to hear about that.
well, I would say that probably my favorite thing that I've been eating recently has been a chili because it's like one of my favorite things to eat. That's one of the recipes I've sort of modified it over time, but it is something like it's pretty close to the same like chili that my mom made when I was growing up. So it has a little bit of that like nostalgic quality to it. And then I think now with the temperatures getting a little bit colder and football on, it's just to me, it's like the most comforting, perfect food that you can eat.
It's so funny. I've said this before on the podcast, but nothing tastes better than nostalgia. Like, nothing tastes better than stuff does in your mind.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We super enjoyed this conversation and cannot wait for people to get your book in their hands.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being here.
Thanks for joining us for today's interview. Dr. Kristin's book will be out in summer of 2023. And when we have a link to her book, we'll add it to the show notes and share it on social media so that you can connect with Kristin and buy her book. And thanks again for listening to the Plant Podcast.